Here we are again, continuing our study through the book of First Corinthians. Today we're going to be chapter 7. This one's actually quite a bit of, well, there's a lot in here, particularly about marriage and sexual immorality, because we talked about that last week, right? Or even the week before, where Paul was calling out someone who had committed sexual immorality within the church in Corinth. So here he's going to just disclose a little bit more about what is his point of view as well as God's point of view. So let's get started. All right. So, and by the way, we are only going to cut this half because chapter 7 is actually pretty long. So, in the essence of trying to keep track with my 10 to 15-minute studies or our studies, not just my studies, because I'm praying that you also study with me. Right. We're going to cut this halfway through. So let's get started. Verse 1, chapter 7. Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me. So he's basically saying that that the church of Corinth had sent a letter over to Paul, and this is possibly because um, probably after Paul had written his first letter. So remember, First Corinthians may have been his second letter. This is a hint about that. Maybe they did send him a letter because he did some other, he mentioned some things and they wanted to write him, and so he was writing this, and then this is probably first and second letters, but we don't know because we don't know where that other letter is. We're just assuming and guessing, right? So, but based on what I see, it's possible that he did send out a letter to them, and now the Corinthians had sent him a letter, and so he's writing them back. This is technically Second Corinthians, right? But let's continue. That's besides the point. Let's go. So he continues. It says, "It is good for a man not to touch a woman." Now he's talking about a single men who, outside of marriage, sex it shouldn't be considered something that would need to or should be done, right? Verse 2, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife and let each woman have her own husband. He's basically saying, in essence, well, if you are going to have sexual immorality, whether you're going to have sex outside of marriage, you might as well be married, right? Verse 3, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Love each other. Verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. What? Let's continue though. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife dies. So does not die. Sorry. So basically, in essence, this is basically he's trying to say it's like, you know what? You got to love each other in a way that your body is not your own. It is for you to give to your spouse. Or the husband, give it to your wife. Wife, give it to your spouse. Right? It's not for anyone else. It's the unity of man and wife to be joined together as one, right? So this is in a sense like you really have no say over your body. You can't really give it to anyone else. You shouldn't, at least. So if you want to bring up the things that some of the people did in the past, go right ahead. But he's just saying here, in essence, man and wife. Jesus even said it. Man, cling to your wife. Woman, cling to your husband, right? And you be joined together as one. It is not your body to give to anyone else, but to your spouse, right? Verse 5, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time. So it's basically saying, hey, in do not say no to having sex with each other, but unless, of course, you are going to consent that, hey, we're going to fast, we're not going to do this, because he does this, say in the next part of this verse, right? Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self control. So, in essence, remember the process of fasting is not only for you to get closer to God, but it also helps develop this self control, the control over the desires of this flesh. So, as a married person, and I'm not speaking out of experience because, well, I was married a long time ago and it didn't really work out well, but in essence, as a married person, you join together as one. Sex is a communal thing with each other, and it has to be done as husband and wife. But there are times when you have to fast from that in order to develop self control. Now, outside of marriage, when you're not even married, the self control, the fasting, that has to be done in order for you to be wholly representative of God, right? And we will see that in some of the verses here as we go through. So, as we continue, but I say this as a concession. This is verse 6, not as a commandment. So this is not a commandment, right? For I wish that all men were even as I myself, which tells me that he was single. Paul was single, which basically saying, you know what? I wish guys would be single. Why? Because, well, we'll see it in the next few verses, right? Being single has a responsibility, especially when one is responsible to the Lord as a messenger of the Lord, as a servant of God. All right, let's continue though. We'll see that. For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. So, talking about the different gifts, and we'll get into that in chapter 12, and we also talked about it in Romans chapter 12, right? All the different gifts that each person is given. Some people may have more than one gift, but we are given a gift from God in order to pursue and do the things that God has called us to do, right? Whether that's teaching, prophesying, um, what other gifts is there? Helping each other, serving in any kind of ministry, right? Donating to the church, or any type of financial means, prayer, um, all those different kinds of gifts. Anywho, verse 8, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, so here's a condition, right? So it's better for someone to be single. However, if they cannot exercise self-control, this is in relation to sexual immorality, right? So if a man or a woman, or a widow in this case, would like to, cannot control themselves in the sexual part of it, right? Whether that's porn, or, going out and sleeping with multiple partners. And of course, we see that in today's world. If you cannot exercise self control, what's the next part of that verse? In verse 9, it says, let them marry, right? So he's saying that singlehood is good. It's better. And of course, I kind of think that too, but we'll see some of the verses that actually correlate to that. But if self control is not exercised, by all means, someone needs to get married, especially when it comes to the sexual part, right? So, in a case where someone likes to go out and go to clubs or party or anything like that, and looks after, let's say, a man looks after a woman lustfully, or a woman looks after a man lustfully, right? There is that self control that is not being exercised. So, that person would be better off getting married. That way, that desire would be put on towards the wife or the husband. Hope that makes sense. Okay. Carry on in verse 9. Carry on. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. As this is basically saying that, right? So this passion, this desire to be with someone else, to have sort of a relationship, and then it turns into that sexual desire of it, right? This passion. It is better for someone to be married in order for those desires and passions to be lived out, rather than singlehood and carrying on life as if, hey, I'm going to sleep with whoever I want and do whatever it is I want to do while I'm you know living this life, which isn't really proper at all. Anyway, verse 10. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So he's saying, this is the Lord is saying, right? A wife is not to depart from her husband, and we heard Jesus talk about this, or we read about it. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, and this is talking about separation or divorce, right? Let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife, right? So, talking about that, be reconciled if you can. If the woman, and now we're talking about someone who is in the Lord, someone a Christian, an unbeliever. I know in this world, day and age, people tend to want to come together, but then always find an excuse in order to have a divorce because they want to pursue some other sexual immorality, right? Or something, right? Um, in the cases when the woman this gets divorced or separated, she ought to remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Um, there is a I can't remember. It's somewhere in where Jesus actually talks about this, right? When he was asked, I think it was when he was asked about, uh, when a wife and the husband dies and she has to marry the brother or something like that, and if the seven brothers they all die, what happens? So in a sense, or no, that's a totally different topic. Sorry, I just got sidetracked there. But anywho, when a woman gets separated or divorced, she ought to remain unmarried, otherwise it's considered adultery. Anywho, verse 12. But to the rest, I, not the Lord. Okay, so this is Paul saying, if any brother has a wife who does not believe and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. Verse 13, and a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. So, in a case where, okay, a married couple are together, one goes to church and discovers the Lord and gives her life to the Lord, or gives his life to the Lord, and the spouse is still an unbeliever, basically do not divorce that person or do not separate from that person unless it's absolutely necessary, right? Especially if they are still willing to live with each other, especially if the unbeliever wants to still live with that believer. Okay, let's continue for why. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Of course, I've seen it in cases where it's usually the wife who comes to the Lord first, and by her changed lifestyle, somehow the Lord works in her life to where it brings the husband along. I've seen it. I've seen it when I was living down in Orange County. Of course, sometimes it takes a little bit longer, but somehow the husband does get sanctified by it. Um, it happens, right? So as the husband is, or the woman or the husband is being changed by the Lord, that spouse is going to be seeing this change, this transformation, and possibly want to have what Christ has done for this woman or husband. Okay, let's continue. Um, that was a bit of a sidetrack, wasn't it? All right, so for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases. In a case where the husband or the wife comes to Christ and that other spouse says, I don't want to live with you anymore, and they decide they're going to go ahead and do the divorce, he's saying it's okay. Now, this is Paul, not necessarily the Lord, but of course, the Lord allows things for this to happen. So either that person continues living the life in the world, and this person now who's renewed in Christ continues and serves the Lord, right? But if the unbeliever, a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? We don't know. You can share the gospel with anyone, with your spouse. You are a changed person when you've given your life to Christ and you've repented and you've renewed your life, and the Spirit is renewing your life. But it is really not up to you to save or cleanse that person. But by your actions, by your love, the person will see it. And if they choose, they want to run away and do their own thing, let them be. Right? Verse 17, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. I believe he's talking about the gifts here. Verse 18, was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not be circumcised, or let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Basically, the whole idea of the Jew and um, the Gentile, right? So if a Jew or a Gentile was called and um, became a minister, he doesn't have to be circumcised in order to become a Jew and do what God has called him to do. right? 19, where circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. So the whole idea of circumcision doesn't do anything for you except it was called, or it was a covenant between God and the Jews so that they would be a separate holy people. Circumcision is not necessary for the unbelieving people, or not the unbelieving, but the Gentiles who have come to the Lord and are now in ministry, right? It's not necessary. And uncircumcision is nothing. So at the same time, even if a Jew had fallen apart and they were uncircumcised, or no, we're talking about the Gentiles now who are uncircumcision, right? They're uncircumcised. They don't have that covenant with. They don't have to be circumcised, right? Continue it, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters, right? The commandments of God. Love God above all else, above with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor, and then the whole 10 Commandments follows after that, right? Verse 20: let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called, single, married, slave, uh, master. Verse 21 talks about that. Were you called while a slave? Now we're talking about servanthood, right? The slaves that we have an idea of, those who are being tortured in bondage and all that. That's different from the slave that we're talking about there. Those were actual servants. Do not be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. This is basically talking about when you are freed from sin, you are free indeed, right? Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. And basically, we are a servant of Christ when we're called by Christ. So whether he's giving the idea of like between the servant and master um, idea here is when a master is called to be a servant of Christ, he is a servant of Christ, a slave to Christ. Verse 23, you were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. What does it mean to be bought at a price? Jesus. Jesus paid by his blood when he died on the cross. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. So wrapping it up, I'm way past the 15-minute mark. Basically, remember, as a single man, if you're called, or woman, if you're called to be in ministry, single, remain that is. If you are married and you're called to be in ministry and your partner is not a believer, continue it, right? Go for what God has called you to do and be obedient and know that it is God who frees us from the slavery of sin. Y'all be blessed.